The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Every light on the tactical board turned red at once, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I am Vex Ashar Dole, Senior Intelligence Analyst of the Kalithi Dominion, and I built the trap that was supposed to end the human problem forever. I built it with my own hands, from stolen human battle plans, tested it 1,000 times in simulation, and watched it fail in real life within 11 minutes. This is the record of how that happened, written not as a victory report, but as a warning. 3 weeks earlier, none of us believed humans were worth this much attention. My superiors called them a curiosity, a species that lived barely a century, fought among themselves constantly, and somehow still managed to survive every fight we threw at them. I did not believe the stories at first. I had read the reports of ships vanishing near human territory, of weapons that behaved strangely after human hands touched them, of soldiers who described feeling watched, even when their scanners showed nothing nearby. I dismissed most of it as fear dressed up as data. Fear makes good soldiers write bad reports. My assignment came directly from Fleet Command, delivered by a courier drone that arrived at my station without warning. Project Mirror Frame. The name alone told me nothing, but the files attached to it told me everything. Over the past 2 years, Dominion intelligence had captured fragments of human military doctrine, salvaged from wrecked ships, stolen from listening posts, and pieced together by analysts like me, who spent sleepless months trying to understand a species that thought in ways no algorithm could fully predict. The plan was simple in concept and monstrous in ambition. We would build a trap using humanity's own tactics, aimed at a single human scout ship, to prove once and for all that their technology and their strategies could be turned against them. I remember standing in the briefing hall on the command deck, looking at 100 faces that all wore the same expression of quiet confidence. Admiral Threll Koss stood at the head of the room, tall and composed, her voice carrying easily across the silence. She told us that humanity's greatest weakness was arrogance disguised as adaptability. She told us that if we could not outthink them, we would simply think exactly like them and use their own instincts as a leash. I remember nodding along with everyone else, because at the time, it made perfect sense. You cannot outhuman the humans, she said, but you can wear their skin long enough to lead them somewhere they cannot escape. The target was the ISV Kestrel Dawn, a small human vessel assigned to routine border patrol near a disputed system on the edge of Dominion space. Intelligence reports described it as lightly armed, minimally crude, and utterly unremarkable. It was, by every measure we had, the perfect test subject. If the trap worked on a ship this unimportant, it would work on anything humanity could send against us. I spent the following days overseeing the construction of the ambush myself, because I refused to let this project fail through someone else's carelessness. We built a minefield using a modified version of an electromagnetic pulse doctrine, copied directly from human wreckage, designed to disable a ship's systems without destroying it outright. Around that minefield, we wove a jamming net based on human electronic countermeasure protocols, thick enough to blind any sensor array that dared approach. And surrounding both of these layers, we positioned our main fleet in a crossfire formation, borrowed from a human carrier group tactic that Dominion strategists had studied for months. Every piece of this trap was human in origin, repurposed and refined by Dominion engineers, who believed they finally understood the enemy's mind well enough to defeat it, using nothing but the enemy's own ideas. I felt something close to pride as I watched the final simulation complete successfully for the 20th time. There was an elegance to it that I had rarely seen in Dominion strategy before, an elegance born from irony. We were not simply defeating humans with superior firepower or superior numbers. We were defeating them with themselves, holding up a mirror so perfect that they would not recognize their own reflection until it was too late to matter. When the Kestrel Dawn finally crossed into the ambush zone, exactly on schedule, exactly as our projections predicted, I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction. The ship moved through the outer boundary of the minefield without hesitation, its sensors apparently unable to detect the modified charges hidden among ordinary debris and asteroid fragments. Our jamming net activated in perfect synchronization, and within seconds the Kestrel Dawn's communications array fell silent. On my display, the ship's outer hull lights flickered and dimmed, and its main drive signature dropped to almost nothing. By every measure available to us, The vessel had gone dark, crippled exactly as designed, drifting helplessly at the center of a cage built from its own species' wisdom. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, a small detail caught my attention almost immediately, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but that I now recognize as the first crack in everything we believed about that night. A single life signature detached from the kestrel dawn and moved outward, not away from the minefield as any reasonable survivor would attempt, but directly into it. I remember staring at that single moving dot on my display for a long moment, uncertain what I was seeing. My tactical officer suggested it was a malfunction, perhaps a piece of debris ejected during the ship's power failure. I noted it in my log as an anomaly, requiring further observation, then returned my attention to the fleet formation, confident that whatever it was, it could not possibly threaten a trap built from 10,000 hours of careful engineering. I did not know her name yet. I did not know that the single figure moving through open space toward the heart of our minefield was not fleeing danger, but walking directly into it with the calm deliberation of someone who had done this kind of work 100 times before. I did not know that within the next several hours, everything I believed about human technology, human strategy, and human nature would be dismantled piece by piece, not by an admiral or a general, but by a technician whose name did not even appear on any Dominion threat assessment before that night. The minutes that followed felt endless. My console showed steady readings across the minefield, each charge reporting normal status, each sensor node confirming the jamming net remained intact. The Dominion fleet held position exactly as planned, patient predators waiting for the order to close in. I watched the single human figure drift closer to the nearest mine cluster, moving with a steadiness that struck me as strange for someone supposedly fleeing a disabled ship in the vacuum of space. There was no panic in the movement pattern our sensors recorded. There was no erratic drifting, no wasted motion, nothing that matched the behavioral models we had built from years of studying frightened crews abandoning damaged vessels. I flagged the movement pattern as unusual and requested additional sensor resolution, but the jamming net that we ourselves had built now worked against our own attempt to study the anomaly closely. It was, I would later realize, an early and almost amusing irony that the very system designed to blind the kestrel dawn was also partially blinding us to what was happening inside our own trap. At the time, however, I felt only mild frustration, the kind of frustration that comes from incomplete data rather than genuine concern. My superiors were already discussing the timing of the final closing maneuver, the moment when our fleet would tighten the crossfire pattern and force the crippled human vessel into full surrender. I want to be honest in this record, because honesty is the only thing that gives this account any value to those who read it after me. At that moment, I believed we had already won. I believed the human ship was finished, its crew helpless, its technology neutralized by a plan so carefully constructed that no reasonable species could escape it. I remember turning to my assistant, a younger analyst named Ivan Rask, and telling him that this operation would be studied in academies for generations, that we had finally solved the puzzle that humanity represented. He smiled, and I smiled, and neither of us understood how completely wrong we were. The single figure reached the outer edge of the nearest mine cluster and stopped moving. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. I remember the silence on the command deck during that minute, the way every officer present seemed to lean slightly forward, waiting for something, though none of us could have said exactly what. Then, without warning, one of the mines in that cluster changed its status designation on my display, shifting from active to a category our system did not recognize. I remember the exact sensation of my stomach tightening as I stared at that unfamiliar status marker, a small icon blinking in a color our tactical software had never been programmed to display before. I called for a diagnostic check, assuming some kind of system error, perhaps a corrupted data packet from the jamming net interference. The diagnostic returned nothing useful, only confirming that the mine in question remained physically intact and functional, yet somehow no longer responding to our central control network in the way it should. I remember Ivan leaning over my shoulder, his breath quickening slightly as he studied the readout with me. Neither of us said anything for a long moment, because neither of us wanted to be the first to suggest what now seemed obvious. Something out there was touching our weapons, and whatever it was doing it with a precision that felt uncomfortably deliberate. Admiral Koss ordered a status report, and I gave her the only honest answer I had. One unit in the minefield had gone unresponsive to Central Command, though it remained active and undamaged. She asked whether this posed any threat to the operation, and I told her, with more confidence than I actually felt, that a single malfunctioning unit could not meaningfully affect a field of several hundred mines working in coordination. I believed that when I said it. I had no reason not to believe it. Every simulation we had run accounted for equipment failure, redundancy loss, even sabotage from within our own ranks. What none of our simulations accounted for was a single human technician, alone in open space, calmly reading the internal architecture of a weapon system built from her own species' stolen blueprints, and beginning, mine by mine, to make it hers. I did not understand yet that this was only the beginning. I did not understand that the human drifting through our minefield was not attempting to disarm a weapon at all, but was instead doing something far more unsettling, something that would take my analysts several more hours to fully comprehend. She was not destroying our trap. She was reading it, the way a person might read a letter written in their own handwriting, but signed with someone else's name, recognizing every word, every phrase, every hidden meaning that we, the ones who built the trap, had never fully understood ourselves. By the time the second mine changed status, I had already given the order to increase sensor priority on that sector, diverting power from less critical systems across the fleet. Admiral Kaz remained calm on the surface, but I had served under her long enough to recognize the subtle tension in her voice when she asked for updates now every few minutes, rather than every few hours. I did not yet call this concern. I called it caution. The same caution any competent commander would exercise when facing an unexplained variable in an otherwise successful operation. I still believed, at that point, that we controlled the outcome of this engagement. I still believed the trap was ours. What I did not yet know, what none of us yet knew, was the identity of the figure moving through our minefield, or the quiet, methodical nature of what she was actually doing out there in the dark. Her name was Mara Solano, and she held no combat rank that our records would have flagged as significant. She was, by human classification, a chief warrant officer, specializing in salvage and field repair, the kind of role that Dominion military doctrine considered almost beneath notice. We built our entire trap around the assumption that humanity's danger came from its soldiers, its strategists, its commanders. We never once considered that the greatest threat drifting toward us that night would be a mechanic who simply understood, better than any of us, exactly how the machines we had stolen were built to work, and exactly how they were built to fail. I closed my log for that hour with a note that I still remember writing, because it embarrasses me now to read it back. I wrote that the anomaly remained contained, that operational success was still highly probable, and that further observation would be conducted as resources allowed. I signed it with my full designation and filed it into the permanent record, confident that history would remember this night as the moment the Dominion finally solved the human problem. I could not have been more wrong, and the galaxy would spend a very long time reminding me of exactly how wrong I had been. The next several hours would reveal, piece by piece, exactly how little we understood about the trap we had built, the woman we had trapped, and the species we had spent so long underestimating. But that story belongs to what happened after, when the minds we controlled began speaking a language we no longer recognized, and the jamming net we trusted began telling us lies, dressed up as truth. For now, I will simply say this. We believed we had built a perfect cage using humanity's own hands. We had not yet learned that a cage built from someone else's tools is only as strong as the builder's understanding of those tools, and our understanding, it turned out, was far weaker than our confidence. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder, what would have happened if I had trusted my instincts in that first quiet minute, when the single figure stopped moving, and the silence on the command deck stretched too long? Perhaps nothing would have changed. Perhaps the outcome was decided the moment we chose to build our victory from stolen human wisdom instead of our own, but I did not act on that instinct then, and so the operation continued forward, carrying all of us toward a lesson none of us were prepared to learn. The minefield held its formation for nearly 2 more hours after that first strange status change, and during that time I convinced myself, and much of the command deck along with me, that we had witnessed nothing more than an isolated malfunction. I remember reviewing the sensor logs personally, cross-referencing every data point against our original engineering specifications, searching for some rational explanation that did not involve the unsettling possibility now forming quietly in the back of my mind. I found nothing conclusive, and in the absence of conclusive evidence, I chose to believe the explanation that allowed the operation to continue as planned. This, I now understand, was the second mistake I made that night, though far from the last. Admiral Koss called a brief council with her senior officers during that period, and I was invited to present my findings. I stood before a small gathering of Dominion commanders, each of them veterans of engagements far larger and more violent than anything I had personally witnessed, and I told them what I believed to be true. I told them that a single unresponsive unit within a field of several hundred did not represent a meaningful threat to overall operational integrity. I told them that human technology, even when repurposed by human hands, still operated according to principles we understood well enough to predict and counter. I believed every word I said in that room. I had spent 2 years of my life studying humanity's weapons doctrine, and I was not prepared to admit, even to myself, that a single unnamed technician drifting through open space might understand those weapons better than I did. One of the commanders, a broad-shouldered officer named Doran Vesk, who had fought in 3 prior engagements against human forces, asked a question that I did not have a satisfying answer for. He asked how a single unarmed human, alone and without support, could pose any credible threat to a fleet of this size, regardless of what she was doing to a handful of mines. I told him that she could not, and I believed it when I said it, because the alternative was too strange to accept. Doran nodded, apparently satisfied, and the council moved on to discuss the timing of our final approach, the moment when the fleet would close the crossfire formation and force the Kestrel Dawn into total submission. I returned to my station feeling reassured by that meeting, comforted by the confidence of officers with far more combat experience than I possessed. I did not yet understand that confidence and correctness are not the same thing, and that an entire room of experienced commanders can be wrong together just as easily as one inexperienced analyst can be wrong alone. The mines continued to shift status one by one over the following hours, slowly, deliberately, never more than one change every 20 or 30 minutes, a pace so gradual that it never triggered the kind of alarm that a sudden, obvious attack would have caused. This, I now believe, was not an accident. This was patience, deployed with a precision that Dominion doctrine had never trained me to recognize as dangerous, because Dominion doctrine assumed that danger always announced itself loudly. By the time the 4th mine changed status, I had stopped reporting each individual change to the command council, partly because I did not want to appear alarmist over what still seemed like a contained anomaly, and partly because some quiet, uncomfortable part of my mind had already begun to suspect something I was not yet ready to say aloud. I ran a private analysis on my own console, comparing the pattern of status changes against every human engagement record in our archives, searching for any precedent that might explain what I was witnessing. I found fragments, scattered references in older reports to human personnel reprogramming captured equipment during prior conflicts, but nothing on the scale or with the precision of what appeared to be happening in our minefield that night. I remember the exact moment my analysis shifted from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine unease. I pulled the original engineering schematics for our modified mines, the same schematics our own weapons division had used to build them from captured human wreckage, and I began comparing them line by line against known human electromagnetic pulse doctrine. What I found chilled me in a way that no simulation had ever managed to do. Buried within the original human design, hidden beneath layers of standard military encryption that our engineers had either not noticed or not bothered to fully strip away, was a compatibility layer, a kind of built-in flexibility that allowed authorized human personnel to reconfigure the weapon's targeting priorities without requiring the original activation codes. At first I assumed this was simply an oversight, a piece of legacy code left over from an earlier design iteration that no one had bothered to remove. It took me nearly another hour of careful analysis to understand the more disturbing possibility, one that I eventually included in my final report, with a level of certainty that still unsettles me when I read it back. This compatibility layer was not an oversight at all. It appeared, based on the sophistication and consistency of its implementation, to be a deliberate feature, built into the weapon from the very beginning, designed specifically to allow trained human technicians to adapt captured or damaged equipment in the field, without needing specialized authorization from a central command structure that might not be available during an active engagement. In other words, humanity had built their weapons assuming, from the very start, that those weapons might one day fall into the wrong hands, or find themselves stranded far from proper support, and had quietly engineered a way for their own people to reclaim control over stolen or damaged systems, even under those circumstances. Dominion engineers, in their rush to copy human technology and repurpose it against its original creators, had copied this compatibility layer along with everything else, never suspecting that it represented a vulnerability rather than simply an efficient piece of engineering. We had, without realizing it, handed a trained human technician the exact tool she needed to make our own trap her own. I sat with that realization for a long moment before I brought it to Admiral Koss, because I understood, even then, that this information would change the entire tone of the operation. When I finally presented my findings to her privately, away from the wider council, I watched her expression shift from mild interest to something far more serious as she absorbed what I was telling her. She asked me directly whether this meant the human technician currently drifting through our minefield could potentially seize control of the entire system, not just the handful of units she had already altered. I told her honestly that I did not yet know the limits of what she could do, but that the pattern I was observing suggested a level of understanding that none of us had anticipated. Admiral Koss ordered an immediate increase in fleet readiness, though she stopped short of aborting the operation entirely, a decision I understood even as I privately worried it might prove costly. She reasoned, not unfairly, that a single technician, however skilled, still could not physically overpower an entire Dominion fleet, and that our overwhelming numerical and firepower advantage remained intact, regardless of what happened within the minefield itself. I agreed with her assessment at the time, because it aligned with everything I had been trained to believe about the relationship between individual skill and large-scale military force. What none of us fully appreciated yet was that Mara Solano was not attempting to defeat our fleet through direct confrontation at all. She was doing something far more patient and far more dangerous, quietly turning the very tools we had built to trap her into tools that would soon begin working against us instead, one small, deliberate change at a time. As the operation moved into its final approach phase, I found myself watching the tactical display with a growing sense of unease that I could not fully articulate to my colleagues, most of whom remained confident in our overwhelming advantage. I kept returning to that hidden compatibility layer in my analysis, turning it over in my mind, trying to understand not just what it allowed her to do, but why humanity had built it into their weapons in the first place. It suggested a philosophy of design that felt fundamentally different from anything Dominion engineering embraced, a philosophy built not around the assumption of permanent control, but around the assumption of eventual loss, eventual capture, eventual betrayal, and a quiet, patient preparation for that inevitability. I did not yet understand the full implications of this philosophy, though I would come to understand them very clearly before that night ended. For now, I simply noted my concerns in the official log, requested continued close monitoring of the minefield status, and prepared myself, along with the rest of the fleet, for the final phase of an operation that I was beginning to suspect might not unfold quite as flawlessly as we had all once believed. The mines continued their slow, methodical transformation beneath our feet, and somewhere out there in the dark, alone in the vacuum of space, Mara Solano continued her patient work, reading our stolen trap the way one might read a familiar book, page by page, line by line, understanding every word, long before we ever suspected she had even opened the cover. I requested full access to the Kestrel Dawn's crew manifest, hoping that a name and a service record might help me understand what kind of person could do what I was watching unfold on my display. The record that came back surprised me more than I expected. Mara Solano held no combat citations, no record of frontline engagement, nothing that Dominion doctrine would flag as dangerous. She had spent nearly 15 years in human service repairing damaged equipment, salvaging wrecked vessels, and restoring systems that other technicians had already declared beyond saving. Her file described her as reliable, resourceful, and unusually calm under pressure, qualities that seemed almost mundane on paper, yet somehow felt increasingly significant the longer I watched her work. I began pulling every fragment of salvage history connected to her name, and a pattern started to emerge that unsettled me more than any weapon specification ever could. She had spent years working with equipment that did not belong to her. Equipment recovered from enemy wrecks, damaged Allied ships, unfamiliar systems built by unfamiliar hands. Her entire career had trained her to look at foreign machinery and understand it quickly enough to make it useful again, often with limited tools and no outside support. In another context, this might have made her an asset too minor to notice. In the context of that night, drifting through a minefield built from her own species' stolen doctrine, it made her possibly the single most dangerous person the Dominion could have chosen to trap. I shared this analysis with Ivan, who had by now abandoned any pretense of routine work, and was watching the display with the same growing unease I felt myself. He asked me a question that stayed with me long after that night ended. He asked whether it was possible that humanity had never needed soldiers to defeat us at all, that perhaps their greatest threat had always come from people like Mara Solano, people trained not to fight, but to understand, to adapt, to survive, using whatever materials happened to be within reach. I did not have a confident answer for him then, and I am not certain I have found one even now, writing this account long after the operation ended. The jamming net, which had held steady and reliable for the first several hours of the engagement, began showing small irregularities shortly after I completed my analysis of Mara's service record. At first, these irregularities appeared as minor fluctuations in signal strength, the kind of noise that any complex system might produce under sustained operation. I flagged them for routine review, still holding on to the hope that whatever was happening remained within the boundaries of something we could understand and control. That hope did not survive the next hour. A technician on the electronic warfare team brought an anomaly to my attention that I initially struggled to accept. The telemetry data flowing from our jamming net back to Fleet Command, data we relied upon to confirm that the Kestrel Dawn remained sensor-blind and unable to coordinate any meaningful response, appeared to be subtly inconsistent with the raw signal readings our own sensor arrays were independently recording. In simple terms, the jamming net was telling us one story, while our own instruments were quietly suggesting a different one. I remember the technician's voice shaking slightly as she explained this to me, because neither of us wanted to say the obvious conclusion aloud in a room full of officers who still believed the operation was proceeding exactly as planned. I ran an independent verification myself, cross-referencing raw sensor data against processed jamming net reports across multiple redundant systems, hoping to find some simple technical explanation that did not require me to accept what now seemed increasingly likely. I found none. The jamming net, originally designed and stolen from human electronic countermeasure doctrine, was no longer simply blocking outgoing signals from the Kestrel Dawn. It appeared to be actively generating false telemetry, feeding our own fleet a carefully constructed illusion of continued success, while the actual battlefield situation shifted beneath our notice. I brought this finding directly to Admiral Koss, interrupting a strategy session with the senior counsel to do so, an action that would have been considered a serious breach of protocol under almost any other circumstances. She listened to my report with an expression I had rarely seen on her face before, a controlled but unmistakable flicker of genuine alarm. She asked me directly how a single technician, working alone with no specialized equipment beyond whatever she could carry into open space, could possibly compromise a communications and jamming system as complex as the one we had built. I told her the truth, because I owed her nothing less. I told her that I did not fully understand the mechanism yet, but that the pattern strongly suggested Mara Solano had discovered another hidden layer within the human technology we had copied, one designed specifically to allow authorized personnel to redirect or falsify data streams under circumstances exactly like the one we now found ourselves in. Admiral Koss ordered an immediate independent verification protocol across the entire fleet, bypassing the jamming net's processed telemetry entirely and relying instead on raw sensor feeds from every ship in the formation. This decision likely saved lives that night, though at the time it felt more like a desperate precaution than a confident strategic choice. As the raw data began flowing in, unfiltered by whatever manipulation Mara had introduced into our systems, a far more troubling picture began to emerge across the tactical display, one that bore only a passing resemblance to the confident, controlled operation we believed we had been running for the past several hours. The Kestrel Dawn, which our processed telemetry had continued to report as dark and disabled, showed faint but unmistakable signs of internal power redistribution when viewed through raw sensor data. Something aboard that ship was drawing energy in patterns inconsistent with a fully crippled vessel, patterns that suggested preparation rather than helplessness. I remember staring at that data for a long moment, feeling something shift in my understanding of the entire operation, a growing awareness that we had perhaps never truly disabled the Kestrel Dawn at all, but had instead convinced ourselves of a story that Mara Solano had been quietly writing for us since the very moment the trap first closed around her ship. I want to pause here and explain something about human technology that I did not fully understand until that night, something that fundamentally changed how I approached every piece of intelligence work I conducted afterward. Dominion engineering philosophy, shaped by centuries of stable governance and predictable military doctrine, generally assumes that control, once established, remains established unless actively and forcefully contested. We build our systems to resist attack, to withstand damage, to maintain function under stress. But we rarely design them with the explicit assumption that an enemy might one day gain intimate, detailed understanding of their internal architecture and use that understanding against us from the inside. Human engineering, as I came to understand through painful experience, operates under a very different assumption, one shaped by a history far more chaotic and unpredictable than our own. Humans, it seemed, built their technology assuming that betrayal, capture, and loss of control were not exceptional circumstances to be prevented at all costs, but ordinary risks to be planned for from the very beginning. Every layer of their weapons doctrine, every piece of their communications architecture, every element of the systems we had so confidently copied and repurposed against them, appeared to contain some hidden mechanism designed specifically for the moment when that technology fell into hands it was never meant to serve. This was not a flaw in their design. It was, I came to realize with growing dread, perhaps the single most important feature of their design, one that Dominion engineers had entirely failed to recognize even as they copied it piece by piece into the very trap meant to end humanity's threat forever. I shared this realization with Admiral Koss as the raw sensor data continued to paint an increasingly troubling picture of the battlefield around us. She asked me, with a directness I appreciated even in that moment of growing crisis, what I believed our next course of action should be. I told her, honestly, that I believed we needed to reconsider the entire premise of the operation, that continuing to rely on any system originally derived from human technology now carried a risk we had never properly accounted for in our planning. She agreed, though I could see in her expression that she understood, as I did, how difficult that reconsideration would prove, given how deeply embedded human-derived systems had become throughout our entire tactical infrastructure for this engagement. The final approach phase, originally scheduled to begin within the hour, was delayed while Fleet Command scrambled to develop contingency protocols that did not rely on the jamming net or the modified minefield we now understood might be compromised in ways we could not yet fully measure. I remember the tension on the command deck during those delayed minutes, officers moving between stations with a controlled urgency that had replaced the earlier confidence entirely. Nobody spoke openly about failure, because failure had not yet been confirmed, but the possibility hung in the air around us with a weight that made every conversation feel deliberate and careful. I returned to my analysis of the minefield's compatibility layer, searching for any way to close the vulnerability before Mara could exploit it further, though I already suspected, based on the pace of her earlier work, that she had likely finished whatever preparation she needed, long before we even identified the problem. I ran simulation after simulation, trying to predict what she might do next, but every model I built kept returning the same unsettling conclusion. A technician with sufficient understanding of a system's hidden architecture did not need brute force or overwhelming firepower to turn that system against its owners. She needed only patience, precision, and time, three resources that our own trap, ironically, had given her in abundance by allowing her to drift undisturbed through our minefield for hours while we remained confident in our own success. I remember Ivan asking me, during one of the quieter moments of that delay, whether I believed we could still salvage the operation. I told him that I did not know, and I meant it honestly, because for the first time since Project Mirror Frame began, I genuinely did not know what would happen next. Every advantage we believed we held, every layer of our carefully constructed trap, now felt uncertain, compromised, by a level of understanding that no Dominion analyst, myself included, had properly anticipated when we chose to build our victory from tools we had never truly made our own. As the delayed approach phase finally prepared to begin, Admiral Koss ordered one final verification sweep across every system connected to the operation, determined not to proceed further without a clearer picture of exactly what we were dealing with. That sweep would reveal something far more alarming than anything we had discovered so far, something that would force the entire Dominion fleet to confront just how completely our carefully planned trap had already begun slipping out of our control, replaced piece by piece with something new, something built not by our engineers, but by the quiet, patient hands of a single human technician who understood our stolen weapons better than we ever had. The final verification sweep returned results that silenced the entire command deck for a length of time I can only describe as uncomfortable. Every ship in our fleet, positioned carefully in the crossfire formation we had modeled after human carrier group doctrine, was still reporting normal status through the process telemetry we had originally trusted. But the raw data told a different story entirely, one that made my hands go cold as I read it. The identification friend or foe system, linking every vessel in our fleet, a system originally built using protocols we had extracted from captured human communications equipment, no longer matched the independent sensor readings coming from several ships along the outer edge of our formation. I called for an immediate cross-check, and the technician assigned to that station confirmed what I feared within minutes. The identification handshake connecting our ships together, the very system that told each vessel which nearby contacts were friendly and which were hostile, had been subtly altered. Not disabled, not destroyed, but altered, in a way so precise and so quiet that it had passed through every routine diagnostic check without triggering a single alarm. I remember asking the technician, perhaps unfairly, how something this significant could go unnoticed for so long. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that the entire system had been built from human doctrine that Dominion engineers only partially understood, and that a change made with genuine mastery of that doctrine would naturally be invisible to anyone who lacked the same depth of understanding. Admiral Koss ordered the fleet to hold position immediately, refusing to authorize the final closing maneuver until this new vulnerability could be fully assessed. It was, in hindsight, the correct decision, though it came only minutes before it would have mattered most. As engineers scrambled to isolate the compromised identification system, 3 ships along the outer formation began reporting weapons discharge from what their sensors identified as unauthorized sources within the minefield itself. I watched in stunned silence as tactical displays across the command deck lit up with contact reports that made no logical sense given everything we believed about the battlefield only hours earlier. The mines that Mara Solano had spent hours quietly reconfiguring were no longer simply neutral or disabled. They had been retasked, their targeting priorities rewritten using the exact same identification protocols our own fleet relied upon to distinguish friend from foe. In effect, she had not turned our weapons against us through brute force or obvious sabotage. She had done something far more elegant and far more devastating. She had convinced our own weapons that certain Dominion vessels no longer qualified as friendly targets, using nothing but the compatibility layer and the communication protocols we ourselves had stolen from her species and built directly into the trap meant to capture her. I remember Admiral Koss's voice cutting through the chaos on the command deck, ordering an immediate fleet-wide reset of all identification protocols, a process that under normal circumstances would take only moments, but that now felt agonizingly slow, as every second brought fresh reports of confusion and miscommunication rippling across our formation. Ships that should have recognized each other as allies began hesitating before acting on contact reports, uncertain whether the data reaching them could be trusted. In the confusion of that uncertainty, precious minutes passed, during which our carefully coordinated crossfire formation, the very heart of our entire strategy, began to fracture into something closer to disorganized chaos. I want to be clear about something in this account, because it matters for anyone who reads this record afterward hoping to understand what truly happened that night. No Dominion vessel was ever in serious danger of destruction during this phase of the operation. Mara Solano's alterations, as devastating as they proved to our coordination and our confidence, never once crossed into anything that could reasonably be called an attack on our fleet's survival. The mines she had reconfigured produced confusion, false alarms, and cascading uncertainty throughout our identification network, but they never targeted our ships with lethal intent. I did not understand the significance of this restraint until much later, when I finally had the chance to speak with her directly. But even in the chaos of that moment, some part of me recognized that what we were experiencing was not violence. It was something closer to a lesson, delivered with a precision that felt almost deliberate in its restraint. Admiral Koss, to her credit, recognized within minutes that continuing the operation under these conditions would only compound our confusion further. She ordered the fleet to disengage the crossfire formation entirely, falling back to a defensive posture, while engineers worked to isolate and correct the compromised identification system. I remember watching the tactical display as our carefully constructed formation, the pride of Dominion's strategic planning for the past several months, slowly unwound itself, ships pulling back from positions that no longer made sense, given how thoroughly our understanding of the battlefield had been compromised. Throughout this entire sequence, the Kestrel Dawn remained exactly where it had been since the trap first closed around it, drifting quietly at the center of what used to be our minefield, its outer systems still showing the dim, powered-down signature that had originally convinced us the ship posed no further threat. I found myself staring at that unchanged status for a long moment, struck by the strange contrast between the chaos unfolding across our own fleet and the apparent stillness of the very vessel we had set out to trap in the first place. It occurred to me, with a clarity that felt almost uncomfortable, that the Kestrel Dawn itself had never needed to move at all. Its crew, or at least the single member of its crew who mattered most that night, had already accomplished everything necessary without firing a single shot or activating a single weapon system of their own. I spent the following hour working alongside our engineering teams, attempting to trace exactly how Mara Solano had gained sufficient access to alter our identification protocols from outside the network entirely, using nothing but the mines and jamming systems already present in the minefield around her. What I eventually discovered, and what I later included in my formal report to Fleet Command, painted a picture of technical mastery that I still find difficult to fully articulate even now. She had not hacked our systems in the sense that Dominion doctrine typically imagines such an act, forcing entry through brute computational power or exploiting some obvious software weakness. Instead, she had used the compatibility layer she discovered earlier, the same hidden feature built into human weapons doctrine to allow authorized personnel field access, to essentially present herself to our own network as a legitimate authorized user, one whose commands and alterations our system had no reason to question, because the underlying protocol had never been designed to distinguish between a human technician working for her own side and one working, quite literally, from the inside of a Dominion trap. I remember explaining this to Admiral Koss as clearly as I could, watching her expression shift from frustration to something closer to grudging respect as the full implications settled over her. She asked me directly whether this meant every piece of human-derived technology currently in Dominion service carried the same fundamental vulnerability, and I told her, honestly, that I believed it likely did, given how consistently we had observed the same underlying design philosophy across multiple systems throughout this single engagement. This was, I understood even then, a finding that would extend far beyond the fate of this one operation, one that would eventually reshape how the entire Dominion approached any technology captured or copied from human sources going forward. As our fleet worked to stabilize its identification network and restore some measure of coordinated command, Admiral Koss made a decision that surprised many of the officers present, myself included. Rather than continuing to rely on remote systems that had already proven unreliable, she ordered a direct boarding action against the Kestrel Dawn, intending to physically secure the vessel and, more importantly, to directly confront whoever had spent the past several hours quietly dismantling our entire strategic advantage from within our own trap. I volunteered to accompany the boarding team, driven by a mixture of professional obligation and a personal need to finally understand, face to face, the person who had transformed what should have been my greatest achievement into what was rapidly becoming the most significant failure of my career. The boarding shuttle detached from our command vessel and began its slow approach toward the Kestrel Dawn, weaving carefully through the remains of a minefield that no longer behaved according to any pattern we fully understood. I remember watching the ship grow larger on the shuttle's viewport, its dark hull illuminated only faintly by the distant light of nearby stars, and feeling a strange mixture of professional dread and something almost like curiosity. Whatever waited for us aboard that ship, I understood by then that it would not be the desperate, disabled crew our original intelligence had led us to expect. It would be something far more deliberate, far more prepared, and far more capable than any assessment Dominion doctrine had ever produced about the species we had spent so long underestimating. The shuttle docked against the Kestrel Dawn's forward airlock with a soft mechanical clamp that echoed through the small cabin around us. I stood near the rear of the boarding party, 6 armored Dominion soldiers positioned ahead of me, their weapons held ready but lowered, following strict orders from Admiral Koss to secure the vessel without unnecessary escalation. I remember the tension in that narrow corridor as the airlock cycled open, every one of us uncertain what kind of resistance we might encounter after everything that had already happened that night. What we found instead was almost anticlimactic in a way that somehow felt more unsettling than any armed confrontation could have been. The Kestrel Dawn's interior lighting remained dim, powered by what appeared to be minimal backup systems, consistent with the disabled status our sensors had reported hours earlier. The corridors were empty, quiet, except for the faint hum of failing equipment somewhere deeper within the ship. Our boarding team moved carefully through the vessel, checking compartment after compartment, finding no crew, no resistance, nothing but the ordinary debris of a working ship that had clearly been through a difficult few hours. I remember beginning to wonder whether Mara Solano had somehow returned to a different part of the ship, or whether the figure we had tracked through the minefield had never actually been aboard the Kestrel Dawn at all, until we reached the engineering section near the rear of the vessel and found her exactly where I suppose some part of me had expected her to be all along. She sat on an overturned equipment crate beside an open access panel, a portable diagnostic tool resting on her knee, apparently in the middle of some minor repair when our boarding party arrived. She looked up as we entered, and I remember being struck immediately by how little alarm her expression showed, given that 6 armed Dominion soldiers had just stepped into the room with weapons raised in her direction. She set the diagnostic tool down carefully on the crate beside her, raised her hands in a calm, unhurried gesture that seemed designed more to avoid unnecessary conflict than out of any genuine fear, and waited. I stepped forward past the soldiers, driven by an urge I could not fully explain even to myself, and addressed her directly, identifying myself and asking, somewhat formally given the circumstances, whether she understood the situation she now found herself in. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the desperation or defiance I had expected from someone who had just spent hours dismantling an elaborate trap built specifically to capture her ship. She told me, quite simply, that she understood perfectly well, and that she had understood from the very moment our jamming net first activated hours earlier. I asked her, perhaps foolishly, why she had not attempted to disable the mines entirely, or to escape the minefield once she realized what it was built from. She considered the question seriously before answering, and her response has stayed with me clearly ever since, because it reshaped how I understood everything that had happened that night. She explained that disabling the mines outright would have accomplished very little beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation, since our fleet would simply have regrouped and attempted the operation again with improved countermeasures. Escaping the minefield alone, without addressing the underlying trap itself, would have left her ship and crew vulnerable to exactly the same strategy in the future, deployed against them or against some other human vessel that might not have someone aboard capable of recognizing what was happening in time. Instead, she told me, she had chosen a different goal entirely. Rather than simply surviving the encounter, she had decided to make certain that the entire strategy behind Project Mirror Frame became too costly and too unreliable for the Dominion to ever attempt again with confidence. By quietly demonstrating just how thoroughly human-derived technology could be turned back against the very forces that stole and repurposed it, she had ensured that every future Dominion commander considering a similar operation would now have to weigh that risk seriously, knowing that any trap built from human doctrine might just as easily become a trap for the ones who built it. I asked her how she had known, with such confidence, that the compatibility layer existed within our minds and jamming systems in the first place, given that Dominion engineers themselves had apparently never fully recognized what they were copying. She smiled slightly at this question, and her answer, delivered without any hint of arrogance, revealed something about her species that I had never encountered in any intelligence report I had studied over the previous 2 years. She explained that human military engineering had, for generations, been shaped by a history of conflicts fought against enemies, who frequently captured, studied, and repurposed each other's technology. As a result, an entire tradition of design philosophy had developed around the assumption that any weapon or system might eventually fall into hostile hands, and that the people who built these systems owed it to their own side to plan for that eventuality, rather than simply hope it never happened. She told me that every human technician trained in her field learned to recognize these hidden compatibility layers as a matter of basic professional education, not as some rare or specialized skill reserved for elite operatives. It was, she explained, simply part of understanding how human military technology worked at a fundamental level, the same way any competent engineer might understand the underlying architecture of a system, regardless of who currently controlled it. I remember feeling a strange mixture of professional humiliation and genuine fascination as she spoke, because everything she described made complete sense in hindsight, yet none of it had ever appeared clearly in any Dominion intelligence assessment I had read before that night. I asked her one final question before our boarding team began the process of securing the vessel and preparing to escort her back to our command ship for further debriefing. I asked her whether she had ever doubted her plan would work, given the overwhelming numerical and technological advantage our fleet held throughout the entire operation. She considered this question longer than any of the others, and when she finally answered, her voice carried a quiet certainty that I have thought about often in the time since that night. She told me that she had never needed to defeat our fleet directly, because our fleet's strength had never actually been the real obstacle standing between her and success. The real obstacle, she explained, had always been time, and our own confidence had given her more time than she needed, precisely because we believed ourselves too clever to be outmaneuvered by a single unarmed technician working alone in the dark. Admiral Koss arrived aboard the Kestrel Dawn shortly after our initial exchange, having decided personally to oversee the final stages of what remained, technically, a successful boarding action, even if almost nothing else about the operation had unfolded as originally planned. I watched the two of them speak briefly, Admiral Koss maintaining her composed, professional bearing even as the full weight of the night's events settled visibly across her expression. Mara Solano answered every question posed to her with the same calm, unhurried honesty she had shown me, offering no resistance, no deception, and remarkably little concern for her own immediate circumstances, as though she understood, correctly as it turned out, that the true consequences of that night would extend far beyond whatever happened to her personally in the hours that followed. The formal debriefing that took place aboard our command vessel over the following days confirmed everything Mara Solano had told us, and added considerable additional detail that Dominion analysts, myself included, spent weeks afterward struggling to fully absorb. Her actions that night had not only compromised the specific systems deployed during Project Mirrorframe, but had provided invaluable insight into design philosophies embedded throughout a wide range of human military technology that Dominion forces had captured or studied over the preceding years. Fleet Command ordered an immediate and comprehensive review of every human-derived system currently in Dominion service, a review that would ultimately reveal similar hidden vulnerabilities scattered throughout technology we had confidently deployed across numerous other operations, none of which had yet been tested against an opponent with sufficient understanding to exploit them. I remember sitting alone in my quarters during those final days of debriefing, reviewing my own initial reports from the beginning of the operation, the ones written with such confident certainty that our trap represented an elegant, flawless solution to the human problem. I found myself unable to fully reconcile the analyst who wrote those early reports with the one now compiling a very different assessment, one that acknowledged, with considerable professional discomfort, just how fundamentally we had misunderstood the species we believed ourselves capable of defeating, using nothing but their own carefully studied tactics. Project Mirrorframe was formally suspended within a week of the Kestrel Dawn encounter, its resources redirected toward a broader initiative aimed at understanding, rather than simply copying, the underlying philosophy behind human military design. I was reassigned to lead this new initiative, a decision that Admiral Koss explained to me personally, telling me that my willingness to recognize and report the operation's failures honestly, rather than concealing them to protect my own reputation, had demonstrated exactly the kind of clear thinking the Dominion needed, as it reconsidered its entire approach toward humanity going forward. I accepted the assignment with a mixture of professional pride and lingering unease, aware that the lessons of that single night would likely take years, if not decades, to fully absorb across an organization as large and as historically confident as the Dominion military. Months have passed since the Kestrel Dawn encounter, and I find myself writing this final account not as a triumphant record of Dominion achievement, but as a warning intended for anyone who might one day consider repeating the mistake we made that night. I have spent countless hours since then reviewing every fragment of human technology currently cataloged within Dominion archives, searching for similar hidden layers, similar quiet assumptions built into their engineering that reveal far more about human nature than any diplomatic report or battlefield encounter ever managed to convey. What I have found, again and again, is a consistent pattern that I believe every species sharing this galaxy with humanity would do well to understand clearly before making the same assumptions we once made so confidently. The galaxy has long spoken of humanity with a particular kind of fear, whispered in briefing rooms and command councils across dozens of species who have encountered them in one form or another. I used to believe this fear stemmed from humanity's unpredictable aggression, their willingness to fight even when the odds appeared hopeless, or perhaps from the strange, almost unsettling speed with which they adapted to new forms of conflict. I no longer believe this is the true source of the fear humanity inspires throughout known space. Having studied them closely, having spoken directly with one of their own, and having watched an entire fleet's confident strategy unravel at the hands of a single unarmed technician, I now understand that the true nightmare humanity represents has very little to do with weapons or aggression at all. The true nightmare, as I have come to understand it, lies in a philosophy woven so deeply into everything humanity builds that even they themselves rarely discuss it openly, because to them, it simply represents common sense rather than any deliberate strategic advantage. Humanity builds every piece of technology, every weapon, every system of communication and coordination, with the quiet, patient assumption that someday, somehow, that technology might be stolen, captured, repurposed, or turned against them by an enemy who believes they finally understand it well enough to use it as a weapon. Rather than treating this possibility as a failure to be prevented at all costs, humanity has instead built an entire doctrine around planning for it, ensuring that even in the moment of apparent defeat, a single trained individual retains the ability to reclaim control, to turn captured advantage back into unexpected vulnerability for whoever believed they had already won. This, I have come to believe, is the real reason a human warship arriving in contested space unsettles even the most confident Dominion commanders, far more than any single ship's weapons or crew ever could on their own. It is not the ship itself that represents the danger, nor even the crew aboard it, however skilled they might prove to be under pressure. It is the quiet certainty that everything aboard that vessel, every weapon, every system, every piece of technology humanity has ever built, carries within it the patient assumption that one day it might be used against its creators, and has therefore already been prepared, generations in advance, for exactly that possibility. I think often about my final conversation with Mara Solano before she was formally processed and eventually returned to human custody as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated in the weeks following the encounter. I asked her, during one of our final debriefing sessions, whether she believed humanity's approach to technology stemmed from a particular fear of betrayal or simply from a realistic understanding of how conflict tends to unfold over time. She told me that she did not believe it was fear at all, but rather a kind of humility, an acknowledgement that no side ever truly holds permanent advantage over another, and that the wisest response to this reality was not to pretend otherwise, but to prepare quietly for the moment when that advantage inevitably shifts. I found myself thinking about her answer long after our conversation ended, turning it over in my mind during quiet moments between assignments, comparing it against everything Dominion doctrine had taught me to believe about strength, control, and the nature of lasting victory. We had built Project Mirror Frame around a confident assumption that understanding an enemy's tactics was enough to guarantee success against them, that copying their methods precisely enough would allow us to defeat them using nothing but their own wisdom turned back against them. What we failed to understand, until it was far too late to matter, was that humanity had already anticipated exactly this kind of imitation, had built their entire technological philosophy around the expectation that their tools would eventually be stolen and repurposed, and had quietly prepared countermeasures embedded so deeply within their own design that even the most careful Dominion engineering review had failed to notice them until a single technician revealed their presence through patient, methodical action. I have submitted a formal recommendation to Fleet Command, urging a fundamental reconsideration of how the Dominion approaches any future engagement involving human technology or human personnel. I have argued, as clearly and as honestly as I know how, that we can no longer afford to view humanity as a species defined simply by their weapons or their willingness to fight, but must instead recognize them as a species defined by a deeper, more patient philosophy of preparation, one built not around the arrogance of permanent control, but around the humility of expecting eventual loss and planning meticulously for how to reclaim advantage when that loss occurs. I do not know whether this recommendation will be fully embraced by an organization as vast and historically confident as the Dominion military. I suspect, if I am honest, that some commanders will read reports like this one and dismiss them as an isolated failure, a single unfortunate encounter that does not necessarily represent a broader pattern across the entirety of human strategic doctrine. I hope they are wrong to think this way, though some part of me suspects, based on everything I witnessed that night, that they very much are. I requested reassignment away from further direct operations involving human forces, a request that Admiral Koss granted without hesitation, understanding perhaps better than most that my continued involvement in future engagements might carry a certain bias, shaped too heavily by the events of that single night to remain fully objective in future planning. I have instead dedicated myself entirely to the broader study of human design philosophy, hoping that a deeper, more patient understanding might eventually help the Dominion avoid repeating the mistake that Project Mirrorframe represented so clearly. As I close this account, I find myself returning once more to the title I chose for this record when I first began compiling it for the archives. The plan was flawless, right up until the moment we discovered that flawlessness itself had never been the true test that night. The true test was whether we understood the species we believed ourselves capable of imitating well enough to use their own wisdom against them. And in that test we failed completely, outmaneuvered not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by a single patient mind that understood, long before we ever did, that every weapon built with an assumption of eventual betrayal will always find its way back into the hands of whoever built that assumption into its very foundation in the first place. A human warship arriving in contested space is rarely the true beginning of any galaxy's nightmare, whatever the old stories and whispered warnings might suggest. The true beginning, as I have come to understand through painful, hard-won experience, is the moment any commander, however confident, however well prepared, chooses to believe that humanity's own tools can be turned against them without first understanding exactly why those tools were built the way they were in the first place. We believed we had built the perfect cage using humanity's own hands. We had not yet learned that a species who spends its entire history preparing for eventual betrayal will always, in the end, build their own quiet escape into everything they create, waiting patiently for the moment someone foolish enough to trust in stolen wisdom finally springs the trap they never truly understood at all.